Tragic news has just broken over the film industry as Robert Redford, a Hollywood icon who will live on in perpetuity, passes away at the age of 89. The man who had defined an entire period gently eased away on September 16, 2025, in the tranquility of his Utah home. The pain it caused his loved ones and his legions of admirers was intolerable. He was more than just a screen presence for almost 60 years. The medium of film itself owes a great debt to him. With regular folks, he took home the Oscar. Sundance, the haven for aspiring filmmakers, was founded by him. Plus, he preserved an enduring cultural anecdote for future generations. Robert Redford bestowed upon mankind performances that will be remembered forever, imbued with an uncommon grace and a melancholy nostalgia for a bygone era. However, in the event that with its brilliant brilliance was a spirit wounded by terrible losses, the unimaginable pain of losing his eldest kid, along with other devastating losses and open wounds. The hands of time were merciless, and now the cruelest blow has been dealt by fate. A brave fighter whose art touched people's hearts at their most fundamental level has been taken from us. He was able to bear loss with remarkable serenity and channel his pain into works of beauty. Our position being a witness to more than just Robert Redford's death. It looks like a monument has fallen. The dying out of a light that had been a source of illumination for many years. A voice that roared against injustice and murmured about love, loss, and resilience is now silent. This is more than simply another unfortunate event in Robert Redford's life. This devastating reality has left millions of people gasping for air in their anguish. As a heartfelt respect to a legend, please hit the like button before we embark on this adventure. Someone who gave the world their all and now leaves a legacy of quiet that is louder than fame. Robert Redford was a shining example of Hollywood glamour to the outside world. Still, at the shadowy beginning of his existence, he lay confined to a cramped bed, his frail frame crippled by polio and his innocent soul pulled into darkness where no one would ever see it. Darkness that seemed to be judging him silently, as if even the hands of fate were straining the limits of a legendary soul's capacity to endure suffering. She was born to Charles and Martha on August 18, 1936 in Santa Monica. She spent her childhood in Van Nuys as an only child, living in a modest home as her working-class family weathered the Great Depression. The precariousness of youth was a lesson he had to learn all too early. In the year 1946, when he was a mere 10 years old, he experienced the sting of disinfectant on his skin, the crushing weight of blankets that seemed heavier than bone, and the terrifying horror of trying to force a limb to move when it stubbornly refused. He would remember in retrospect, "I thought I might never walk again, but my mother refused to let me give up." Martha would massage his aching legs night after night, speaking words of encouragement into rooms where stone-cold silence reigned, and he would learn that strength does not always come from winning, but from quietly refusing to give in. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the young actor who would later rule Hollywood had to master his own fears. He found himself drawn into the orbit of a disturbed and furious, a rowdy bunch in the City of Angels, descending into careless evenings that posed more danger than he realized. He finally confessed, "I was always searching for something I couldn't name," after some time had passed. He found solace in sketchbooks filled with imagined lives, in the open sky that promised horizons, and in the fierce rhythm of sport that steadied him. One night the police stopped him for mischief and careless behavior. Though it ended with only a stern warning, the message was unforgettable. It was the moment he realized how close he had come to throwing everything away, and in the steady hand of his protective father, he was redirected from an edge that might have ruined his life, a restless spirit. Through his tennis prowess, he demonstrated his value, even warming up tennis great Pancho Gonzalez at the Los Angeles Tennis Club. A brief spark that suggested he might have a place beyond the forgotten corners of a restless city. However, his story was far from over. In 1955, at the age of 18, Robert suffered the greatest tragedy of his life. His mother, Martha, the woman who had once brought movement back to his paralyzed legs, underwent surgery, and Charles, her only son, never remarried, and the house became a hollow shell, each room echoing with the absence of her voice. What remained was a stern man and a grieving boy, bound not by comfort but by silence, while what started as hope ended in infection and his world went dark. The loss was absolute, and the rupture cut deeper than illness ever had. The easy scaffolding of boyhood crumbled in an instant, leaving Redford with a silence he could never fill. This silence followed him into adulthood, fame and triumphs that should have felt like victory, but instead posed a shadow of a wound no amount of success could cure. Redford would look back on that year as the moment the ground gave way. A sports scholarship to the University of Colorado made him feel 20 feet tall, but heavy drinking soon took it away. The shame of leaving too soon was a stone he carried, as if the world had slammed a door before he had learned to open it. On the verge of despair, he chose exile over surrender. In his early 20s, he wandered through France, Spain, and Italy, living with host families. Painting, drawing, and traveling endless kilometers under exotic sky helped quiet his inner monologue. Resilience is rarely loud, he would confess years later. When fear has all the evidence it needs, it is still going on. He came back to New York in his mid-20s, scarred and tool-bellied, but with a steadfast faith in art, a discipline honed on the trials and courts, and a silent pledge to himself that he would not give in to the shadows, but instead confront them head-on via his labor. In this crucible, the legend we mourn today was born. It was not a mythical beginning, but a childhood that was all too real, a body that was almost taken by disease, a heart that was crushed by grief, mistakes that almost dictated his premature end, and an awakening that was earned the hardest way possible through exile, struggle, and the solitary resolve to start anew. From the outside, Robert Redford's journey back to New York in the late 1950s may have appeared as a youthful aspirant. However, beneath the surface, it was the risky endeavor of a man already wounded by disease, loss, and shame. Wounds that might have shattered him instead fortified his resolve. At the tender age of 22, weighed down by the memory of his mother's death and the guilt of a scholarship he had lost, Redford strode into those cramped city streets, illuminated by neon lights and the odor of damp pavement, without carrying the burden of his past. With the blind optimism of youth and the heavy weight of survival, he studied painting at Pratt Institute, holding brushes and canvases as if they were lifelines. Then, almost afraid to back down, he enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Acting was not a revelation, it was just another brutal climb. At the age of 24, he barely made ends meet with bit parts on television, such as The Twilight Zone, Maverick, and Perry Mason. Jobs so meager, even though they were barely making ends meet, every line he delivered proved he had not given up. Looking back, he would tell it like it was. It wasn't glamorous, not at all. It was survival, plain and simple. The irony was that even survival had its flaws, like the fact that the person the world would eventually revere was his worst enemy. Casting directors beheld his lustrous locks and perfect proportions, and wrote him off as lacking in character, too perfect to be believed. The lad who had battled for acceptance as more than just a vulnerable or careless teenager now fought an invisible war to be recognized for more than just his appearance. It was a golden cage. You're inside, but no one thinks you belong, he later admitted. There was a hint of resentment in his voice even now, only doorways that his gaze unlocked, only to have those doors slam shut again, ensnaring the artist in a harsh prison of aesthetics. After that, the chance that freed them came in 1963. Redford played the role of the youthful spouse opposite Elizabeth Ashley in Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, which was shown on Broadway. And at the age of 27, he stood before an audience and could let his inner fires blaze. Critics could not help but notice his subtle tenderness, timing, and wit, as he captivated the crowd night after night. Keep in mind, for many years the play was a smash hit. It was more than just a victory for Redford, though it felt like a release. I was noticed for the very first time, not merely my appearance, he thought to himself afterwards. Aside from cheers, the roar of the crowd signaled approval, the long overdue realization that his good looks were only part of his appeal. The stage was the natural progression for the screen. Redford relocated to the film industry when Hollywood beckoned. His rising stardom was betrayed by his transition from supporting to main roles. The pain of those early rejections remained with him even as his career took off. His wound becomes the unseen force behind his decisions, instilling in him a desire for autonomy and the drive to one day take charge of stories as a director, so he would never again be seen as a superficial hero. Now that we know he has left us, the irony appears painfully poetic when we look back. Defeating the most fundamental of mistakes was the first step on the path to become the man who would reshape American cinema and create a platform for independent voices through Sundance. You may boil down that skill to symmetry. Furthermore, it was during that time Robert Redford's resiliency blossomed, moving from the shadowy corners of television to the bright lights of Broadway. He demonstrated that he was not a facade but an artist who fought for every inch of his canvas. However, that was just Broadway. He had films waiting in the wings that would launch his career, make him famous around the world, and cement his place in history. What started out as a delicate ascent was on the verge of exploding into an avalanche of growth. It seems like fate was inscribed in blood and fire as the world mourns his passing. The ascent of Robert Redford to the pinnacle of Hollywood stardom was a bright light, but behind that glitz and glamour were scars that the adoring public couldn't see, intimate conflicts that became a part of his stardom. In the 60s and 70s, he appeared unbeatable, carved iconic pictures that defined a period, making him one of the most bankable stars in the world. One of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's characters, the Sundance Kid. The crafty and astute Johnny Hooker from The Sting. Parts played by him include those of the dogged reporter Bob Woodward in A Man's War and Barbra Streisand's love interest in The Way We Were. On their own, these parts could have ensured eternal life. Every standing ovation, though, had an unspoken significance for Redford. The bonds of fame, attractiveness, and expectation subtly tightened with each explosion of acclaim, as the entire globe applauded. Even the look that millions loved had its drawbacks, as he eventually confessed. He had an incident where casting directors flat out told him he was too handsome. The sting of mistrust remained with him even as he reached the pinnacle of his success. Could he be more than just a poster, more than his symmetrical features and golden locks? You could say it's a golden cage. He was clean about how he felt, about how nobody felt he belonged. The resentment of a man who had battled for acceptance his entire life was palpable in his voice. The mixed messages in the applause, even when he was victorious, made him prove time and time again that he was more than just a showman. He was an artist with real passion, purpose, and conviction. The crux of his professional life was that paradox. The door-opening image also menaced his erasure, and he bore the weight of that inhuman paradox like an invisible load. The disappointment felt by viewers when The Great Gatsby, even with his presence, failed to captivate them went beyond what critics could possibly capture. Misstep in the eyes of the public. It served as a sobering reminder of the crushing pressure of expectation to Redford. The harsh reality that a so-called golden boy could not fail ever. However, he did not back down. Rather, he dove headfirst into bigger, riskier projects like All the President's Men, in which cinema bowed not to escape but to urgency, and amusement was traded for truth. The ordeal was torturous, since he was constantly under fire for being overly serious and worried that he may turn off his audience members who had come for the comedic relief he had promised. Yet Redford remained unyielding. He proclaimed that cinema had an obligation to reflect reality, no matter how painful it may be, and he endured the isolation of that belief, like a soldier with invisible wounds. Then, more than any role before it, came the crucible. In order to help regular people, he decided to walk behind the camera. Rumor had it that a dashing leading man could never bring himself to be a director with the vision and discipline of the real deal. On set, he felt like a tightrope walker every day, with naysayers watching for his every move. The result, though, was victory. Oscar-winning, heart-wrenching, intimate picture that broke the taboo around death and won him the title of Best Filmmaker. According to Redford, that Oscar meant more than just being acknowledged. His vindication was a relief from years of doubt and a proclamation that he belonged as a superb storyteller both on and off screen. But his insatiable need went much farther. He planted the seed that would grow into Sundance in 1981, and since then, independent film has been thriving. Once upon a time there was a frail concept that was mocked by skeptics, severely underfunded, and kept alive only by him, his wealth, and his unwavering faith. Advisors said he was taking too big of a chance. On certain nights he felt like giving up, but he kept going. Not for himself but for others, to use the platform he had such a hard time staking out to establish a sanctuary where unfiltered views might be heard for the first time. As a man who refuses the easy road in order to provide hope to others, he endured the solitary of a pilgrim who gave up peace, fortune, and even company. Consequently, Robert Redford's no golden age was ever about superficial brilliance. It was a brilliant but painful experience, weighed down by beauty that felt like a prison, the anticipation that stung like a crushing stone, the weariness of constantly having to prove himself, and the never-ending pressure of turning a flimsy idea into a safe haven. Everyone could see the victory. Redford was a fighter, but it was in the heat of battle that his legacy was made. I don't not as someone who carelessly enjoyed the limelight, but as someone who embraced the darkness that came with fame, battled it, and ultimately transformed it into something lasting. The reality is more apparent than ever before, as we grieve his departure. Even at the peak, there is still pain. That is what the world remembers about the artist, not the celebrity. In the end, it is not leisure but fire that gives rise to greatness. Robert Redford's life seemed like something out of a Hollywood fantasy to everyone. But there was a lot more going on behind the scenes of the spectacular premieres and resounding acclaim, a personal tale, a tale of a man who thought he had finally discovered a refuge untouchable, a tale of love at a young age, and a tale of precarious beginnings. Lola Van Wageningen, a woman of subtle intelligence and unfaltering elegance, became not merely his spouse but also his haven when he wed her in 1958 at the tender age of 22, when he was still an unknown star. They didn't have much glitz at the beginning. They lived in rooms furnished with borrowed furniture, stretched their limited budgets as far as they could go, and made secret vows under dimmer lights that love would be their only fortune. Those early years with Lola were a revelation for Redford, who had experienced sickness, grief, and the pain of uncertainty. Everything seemed to come to a halt in her company. The wonder of a family growing roots was something he finally gave himself permission to believe in, permanence. Their creation was not the Hollywood ideal that others had envisioned, but rather a more delicate sanctuary of loyalty and rebellion, a promise that they would weather any future storms together. Upon its arrival, the first storm was brutal. They had no idea what the other would think. Their firstborn, Scott, was swift and cruel. He only survived for a short time, and his death brought an unfathomable amount of pain, shattering the fragile shelter they had constructed together. The oppressive hush descended upon the nursery that they had painted with quivering expectation, brimming with little clothing and dreams of lullabies. This is the kind of quiet that goes beyond filling spaces. It penetrates people's very beings. After losing a child, Lola, who had been a source of calm strength, was left with empty arms. As she looked down at the deserted crib, a new wound that would not heal almost there. Even Redford was crushed. He knew too well that no amount of love or achievement could ever bring back those lost days. You just learn to live around it. You never heal from something like that. He would mumble years later, but the truth was much harsher. He was not the only one impacted by the loss. It was an integral part of him, molding the eerily silent grief. The fumbled attempts at a smile that never made it to his eyes, and the silent tension that existed between a husband and wife during the dead of night. The world would perceive him as the untouchable Sundance Kid. But he and Lola would always be a father and mother haunted by the specter of an untimely son's death. When they loving someone carries not just their commitment but also the crushing burden of their absence. The arrival of James Yimmy brought hope back to their home like a delicate flame quivering in the breeze. However, it remained a light that shadows would always follow. His frail, undeveloped body was born too soon to face the challenges of life. He fought for each breath, each day a triumph fashioned from adversity. Medical facility hallways took the place of playgrounds. The lullabies of his infancy were the incessant beeping of sterile equipment. Medical records, replete with frightening figures, became a language his parents had to learn. Yimmy never gave up. Countless treatments, surgeries, and liver transplants later, he seemed to draw strength from the love and support of those closest to him with each precarious recovery. Robert Redford found the double existence to be incredibly painful. Under the glare of Hollywood's bright lights, he projected the image of dominance and charisma that the world needed during the day. At night, he would sit in dark hospital rooms, hold his son's little hand, and murmur promises he would never keep. Scripts accompanied him into waiting areas. While his own heart raced with fear, the dialogue practiced in quiet. It was like living under skies that never cleared. You never knew when the storm would break, and the storm did break as he confided in a friend. Bile duct cancer finally took Yimmy's life in 2020 after decades of unbelievable strength. His age was 58. The loss was too much for Redford, who was already an elderly and feeble man at that point. As a father and as a man doomed to endure the merciless symmetry of fate. Decades later, the echoes of Scott's infantile death still echoed, as if the cosmos had come full circle to reopen a never-closed wound. His life's victories were accompanied by an indefatigable shadow cast by the unending grief of losing two boys in separate but equally tragic ways. The world knew Robert Redford as a movie legend, but in his own mind, no amount of recognition, standing ovation, or prize could ever alleviate the immense anguish that he bore as a father who had been betrayed twice. His notoriety bathed him in glory. The world would never know the depth of the sorrow that lay underneath that radiance. Always at his side, Lola weathered every storm and heartache. From the obscurity of their starving youth into the brutal inferno of worldwide celebrity, their marriage lasted over 3 decades. While he vanished into distant sets, pursuing roles, purpose, and a personality bigger than himself, she remained a calm protector for his 4 children, shielding them from the mayhem of Hollywood. They weathered the storm of public scrutiny, rumors, and physical separation as a couple, leaving little room for intimacy. Even the most sturdy bases were eventually worn down by the relentless march of time. The long-awaited break finally occurred in 1985, following 27 years. Silence, grief, and the numbing realization that 2 lives that had once clung to each other like lifelines had gradually drifted into separate realms, replaced scandal, betrayal, and yelling. Not only did Redford lose his spouse, but he also saw the only haven he had ever known shattered. His words about Lola were always free of resentment. On the contrary, he reverently cherished her memory, frequently referring to her as the great love of his life. The lady who helped him steady himself when he was his unproven companion, who suffered through his absences and carried his heavy loads before any praise or admiration was due, deserves recognition. Underneath that thankfulness, though, was a sorrow that few ever witnessed. The heartbreak of a man who learned the hard way that love alone can't conquer obstacles like distance, ambition, and time. The breaking of that link was a more devastating loss than any of his victories. Robert Redford was a legend in the eyes of the world. Even in his most private moments, he carried the weight of the knowledge that not even his most beloved could have weathered the tempests that had molded him. The brutal contrast between image and reality, in addition to the death toll, is what makes this period of Robert Redford's life so harrowing. His charismatic stride across televisions captivated audiences around the globe, win an Oscar for regular folks, outwit criminals like Johnny Hooker, or command truth like Bob Woodward. Still, the actor took his duties seriously, even when he entered houses where quiet prevailed. At once, he existed in the bright light of the camera and in the shadow of the hospital lights. Everyone loved a legendary figure. A father reassuring a vulnerable child with hushed words was someone his family knew. A spouse subtly sustaining a marriage burdened by separation and loss. Arose from those inward struggles an invincibility that critics could not quantify. The very fact that his films were born out of paradox made them so powerful. Ups and downs, triumph and defeat, brightness and darkness. He brought an air of grace to his performances because he had experienced the impossibility of grace himself. Resilience was not just a catchphrase for Redford, it was an enduring commitment to keep going when things got tough and keep creating, even when it looked like everything was falling apart. His decades-long marriage to Lola, Their dedication and eventual breakup, the devastating death of Scott, protracted struggle, and last goodbye to Jamie, the breaking of a love that once thought it could overcome all obstacles. These experiences tested his humanity more than any minor footnote in his career. Robert Redford is the one who deserves the silences that are filled with sorrow, dignity, and perseverance. Hollywood will always own the acclaim. His real impact will live on in the moments of quiet that followed his death, just as much as in the standing ovations. Following the dissolution of his marriage, Robert Redford did not aimlessly pursue the flings that the tabloids conjured up. He walked carefully, trying to determine if his broken heart could still trust. There were fleeting, radiant moments of warmth, and each one held its own truth. He was admired by Sonia Brahe, whose ferocity and creativity were equal to his restless energy, and for a moment there was the delight of two artists crashing. In 1990, while filming Havana, he appeared destined for more with Lena Olin due to their unmistakable chemistry. The reality, however, was far more brutal than the script had promised. When the weight of fame became too much to bear, there were others like costume designer Cathy O'Hare who stayed silently at his side, providing a steadying influence. These relationships weren't failures so much as they were shaky bridges, his feeble efforts to connect his past self with the future self he was fighting to become. Still, not a single one survived. He reopened the wound of a marriage that each ending left behind. Acted as if the wound had never healed. Privately, he confessed, "I always wanted love to steady me, but I also knew too well how devastating it is when it disappears." Jane Fonda, who knew him for decades, gave the most penetrating look. He had the ability to get you near, but he always kept something back, like a locked door. That separation was not apathy, but rather the will to live. The death of a baby was something that Redford had endured, something that most people's hearts cannot. Son, the crumbling of the love that had characterized his childhood, and the long illness and subsequent death of another, coming out on top of those storms, taught me the brutal truth. Love can be both a rescue and a disaster, and if you try to grab it, you can end up breaking it again. Still, he persisted in reaching. A man who yearned for someone who could share not the glitz of premieres, but the stillness of night lay behind the flawless image of the Hollywood icon. He was not after conquest but resonance. A few times he discovered it on occasion, if only for a little while. With each parting he felt both loss and new understanding, aching from flames that burned briefly before fading into ashes, rather than controversy, was what remained. These subsequent relationships were more like watercolors, real, imperfect, and incomplete, than the solid ground of his first marriage. They were significant because they showed Redford as a wounded yet amenable guy, rather than an indestructible icon. Despite bearing the weight of his sorrow, refused to give in to despair, even in his dying days spent alone. Even while he knew love could hurt, he clung to the tenuous, unwavering hope that it could also heal. When discussing Robert Redford's life, it's impossible to separate the stories of his parts, successes, and the extraordinary people who were there with him, making an impression that goes beyond mere fame. Paul Newman and Natalie Wood were the two that left the deepest impression on him. Two friends who came in at various points in the story, but whose exits left holes that no standing ovation could possibly remedy. While they were both young in the early 1960s, Natalie entered his life, individuals tripping under the intense scrutiny of Hollywood. They collaborated on Inside Daisy Clover, and now this land is under the condemnation process. And what started as a business relationship swiftly blossomed into a trust similar to that of a sister. A merciless industry betrayed two delicate souls clinging to one another. In retrospect, Redford remembers how her generosity supported him throughout those tumultuous years, especially when he was nervous about making the transition from stage to movie. She was seen with a fragile combination of fragility and strength that lingered in his memory. The phone call that broke him in 1981, when he was at the peak of his fame. Suddenly, Natalie's life came to an end in waters that left more questions than answers. She was just 43 years old. It became an international headline. It was the crushing quiet of a person whose opinion Redford had relied on. The void where the sound of merriment previously resounded had lived. Although he didn't dwell on her death much, people close to him could feel the impact it had on him. An unforgiving illustration of how quickly even the most radiant lights can go away. She seemed eternally youthful and far away in my mind, but her radiance never faded. Paul Newman's death, which occurred decades after Natalie's, was like a gradual heavy wound. Nothing changed at that time. The moment they worked together in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, their chemistry was electric. However, something more uncommon was born off-screen as a result, a close relationship. They had fun racing automobiles, pulling practical jokes, sharing secrets over quiet drinks, and laughing through the worst of times. Instead of being merely a co-worker, Redford saw in Newman the newscaster who, without saying a word, grasped the strange isolation of celebrity. Through the pain and innumerable private moments that no one could possibly see, their connection deepened. Once again, though, time was cruel. Redford would see Newman whenever he could, but he felt powerless as a part of his own life withered away as his formerly unlimited vitality faded due to lung cancer. Redford, at 72 years old, summed it up with simple words when Newman passed away in 2008 at the age of 83. "My life is missing something right now." It was an honest admission from a man grieving the loss of his chosen brother, not a well-worded statement for the media. It was a double tragedy to lose Natalie in the middle of life and Newman in later years. First, the sudden extinction of a brilliant blaze. Then there's the excruciating pain of seeing even the seemingly unbreakable succumb to the ravages of time and disease. The two defeats brought up memories of the reality that not even the greatest can evade death, and that no amount of praise will protect a person's emotions from the pain of loss. But even in the stillness they left, he felt thankful. For the support of Natalie during his unsteadiness, and for the laughter of Newman, which helped him weather storms. The real Sundance Kid was a man who in his latter years spent his time in a mental theater, cheering on the spirits of performers who would never return to the spotlight. His films will be cherished by many generations. However, Robert Redford held on to the memories of the people he loved, the joy they offered, and the void left behind when they passed away too soon, right up until his final breath. The late 1990s brought a more delicate human light to Robert Redford's story, which had been shrouded in victory and sorrow for a long time. At that moment, he crossed paths with Sybil Sagers, an artist of German Berber descent, whose existence was defined more by the primal patience of nature than by scripts or premieres. Sybil proposed quietness, while Hollywood insisted on chaos. She carved out new territory where trauma had previously manifested. She was like rain falling on a desert for Redford when they met. Surprising, delicate, and irresistible. After spending time with her, he would tell his friends that he finally felt the earth beneath him breathe again, something that had been missing for decades. Their love was not sparked by the excitement of youth, but by the slow, steady beat of two spirits who had been through enough to know there was no need to hurry. When he was with Sybil, Robert Redford was not the famous actor, idolized by the general population. He had simply become a man who had endured grief without letting it break him. Redford had already defined it in terms devoid of glitz but laden with reality when they wed in 2009 at the age of 73. "I feel like I'm starting over." That one comment was the culmination of a lifetime of seeking and longing for the serenity that had evaded him. Couples find not just love, but a vocation when they unite. They worked from their Santa Fe house, beneath expansive skies, capable of holding both calm and unexpected downpours, and they made the path of the downpour an artistic and spiritual endeavor. Stories of the earth's delicate beauty and impending danger were brought to life by Sybil's vibrant paintings and Redford's steady, solemn voice. Viewers saw it as literature, they saw it as a form of devotion. Even though the stage was adorned with water ripple images and music billowed like desert wind on those occasions, Redford was not performing. Alongside the lady who had become his partner and sanctuary, he was speaking from the depths of his soul. An innocence that had been missing from his life up until this point was there in its last chapter. From 1958 onward, I am not the same young spouse who counted borrowed funds. No longer the distraught dad who visits his sick child in the hospital.
The once laughing friend is now just a stranger staring at empty chairs, a man who had traversed barren wasteland in search of the sound of rain. He was not asked by Sybil to prove himself, or bear the burden of fame. Being alive wasn't about love with her, quietness, an opportunity to inhale. When he finally got it, healing wasn't about no wounds at all, it was about grace. Even though the wounds were still visible, he picked up the habit of carrying them around with him, as if they had been washed away, smoothed by the passage of time, and were no longer dangerous. After been denied it for the majority of his life, Robert Redford finally found it in Sybil's presence, peaceful harbor, a steadying hand that didn't demand anything in return, unconditional love that healed all wounds. Then the stage was cut off. Robert Redford's gait, which had been strong enough to traverse mountains and movie sets, became more measured as he neared the end of his life. Once resonating with conviction across theaters, his voice now barely cracks a whisper, but he never lost his acute mind, grounded in Sibylla and the earth.
It was this woman who had finally brought him rain after decades of parched land. He bore the wounds of disease and the weariness of years spent fighting against the passage of time in private, but he bore it all with the unassuming grace that had been his defining characteristic since he was a young lad. September 16, 2025 followed. He let out a final breath amid the tranquility of his Utah house, where the vast desert sky hung low over him and the natural world encircled him. There was no great farewell to him. Rather, there was a quiet acceptance of his inevitable passing, the last breath capping off a life that had weathered storms, suffered losses, and yet pledged to keep hoping. It signaled the end of a period for the entire globe. For his loved ones, it meant the end of everything, the abrupt disintegration of the delicate harmony they had constructed around him. There are no words to describe the utter sadness that Sybil felt. She had been a rock for him, a collaborator in silence and creativity, and a steadying influence throughout his storms. Their once art-filled home is now music, and hushed pleas for the planet sounded devoid of presence. A deafening stillness replaced his voice as he had described her work of art. After he released her hands, there was nothing but space. Not for an icon, but for the father and grandpa who had been a constant presence despite his scars. Shauna, Amy, and Dylan, together with his grandkids, grieved. The garden where feelings of loss were acutely felt, the dinner table without a seat. He had stopped laughing as the wind carried his words, and their conversations would float on indefinitely. His death reopened all the wounds that had previously defined their existence. Little Scott's delicate breath has departed. In 2020, Shamey finally found relief after decades of pain. His life had been emptied of meaning by the departure of pals like Paul Newman and Natalie Wood. His loved ones now had to shoulder the total stillness. None of the applause could break the heaviness and sharpness of the stillness. Reports proclaimed the downfall of a giant as soon as the news spread over the globe. There was an outpouring of tributes. Many people are eager to proclaim his greatness, directors, actors, presidents, and fans. However, in the serene Utah landscape, the dawn was personal and undocumented. A scarf that carried his aroma, an artwork he had left behind in the middle, and the chair by the window that would never support him again were the mementos that Sybil held dear. Their sorrow was unadorned by myth, but pierced by the absence of him, and his children sobbed like those who had known loss all too well. They could no longer bear the absurdity that each room in the home resounded both with and without him. It will still be continued by them, as it is their duty to do so. Exactly like he used to, paying tribute to him in the midst of a storm that brings back memories of his perseverance, in the rain that murmurs mending, in the stillness that holds his teachings. Robert Redford's real brilliance never lay in the glitz of Hollywood, but in the resiliency of the human spirit. Even now, his absence is the most constant presence in the lives of his loved ones. Some figures in history are immortalized in shining light. Then there are the legendary people whose stories serve as a beacon for future generations. When it came to the golden age of Hollywood, Robert Redford was more than just the face. As its conscience, its restless soul, and a living reminder that there is shadow for every light, he was indispensable. Sacrifice is the driving force behind every success. Talking about him isn't only about movies or praise, it's about a guy who transformed his wounds into knowledge, who silently weathered storms, and whose stories of personal suffering resonated around the globe. Everyone will never forget the Sundance Kid, Sting's cunning genius, and the impassioned cry of every single one of the members of the president's staff, the unassuming power of commoners. But he was never at his best when the cameras were rolling. It was in the way he persevered through tragedy without succumbing to it, embraced beauty without letting it blind him, and maintained his honor while embracing celebrity. His face was beloved by audiences for many years. Honesty, however, was uncovered by those who persisted in their investigation. He didn't get where he is now by being vain, but considering bravery, profundity, and the conviction that art was significant due to the importance of truth. Plus, he showed courage and vision when he got behind the camera. The courage to share tales of breakage, solitude, and perseverance, tales that reflected the wounds he bore. However, Redford's impact goes beyond the silver screen. Sundance, a delicate idea he conceived in 1981 that eventually bloomed into a worldwide haven, stands as his greatest legacy, in favor of opinions that the dominant culture may have buried. It was always about her. The story revolved around the artists he revived, the ideas he would not allow die, and the innumerable filmmakers whose careers took off when he dared to champion their cause. He was brilliant in this. Instead of erecting temples in his own name, he provided stepping stones for others. Art, in his view, was not a form of vain pursuit, but rather a bond between people and reality. He took great care of Sundance throughout his life, even as he grew older, much like a gardener. He recognized it was a sacred spark that needed protecting, even as he admitted his worry that business would consume its essence. Even in death, he protected it. As a result of his decades-long career as an actor, director, producer, and devoted caretaker of his beloved Utah estate, which was formerly associated with Sundance, Redford amassed an estimated $200 million in worldly fortune at the time of his passing. Despite all the stats, he never showed off his wealth. A life well balanced with only art, nature, and family remaining important to him was his goal. Projects continued to pile up on his desk as his health deteriorated. He had many stories he wanted to tell, environmental movements he wanted to start, and unfinished drawings. His closest friends and family remarked that even when he passed away, his passion for his work remained strong. An artist's eternal condition is that of a seeker who gives without ceasing. The one that Robert Redford starred in narrative hits home because it was far from flawless. There was a human at its core. He went through setbacks that would have shattered anyone else. 2 boys captured in separate decades. Tragic loss of friends like Paul Newman and Natalie Wood. A troubled marriage that crumbled under the pressure of stardom. But he never gave up. He turned his pain into strength by bearing his wounds, as a testimony that it is possible to persevere in the face of adversity and continue doing art, helping others, and having faith in a better future. That is why I can't bear to be without him this evening. His humanity, rather than his invincibility, proved that greatness does not come from a place of ease but from the crucible. Now that Robert Redford's performance has come to an end, how can we pay tribute to him? Instead of heartless headlines, let us remember, be grateful, and whisper memories across the ages. Make your feelings known if his videos resonated with you, if his bravery inspired you, or if his trip has left you with a heavy heart tonight. Say a prayer, tell a story, or quietly express your appreciation. Not on a regular basis, but as a mark of reverence for a man who sacrificed all for us and who bestowed upon us an honor far beyond fame. This serves as a timely reminder that what matters most is not praise but perseverance, not stardom but empathy. May Robert Redford forever rest in peace. The stories he shared, the voices he empowered, and the lives he subtly affected will forever carry his soul. His legacy lives on even when the lights go off. Robert Redford's legacy endures in the work of every filmmaker he influenced, the lives of every audience he touched, and the resilience of every heart that finds strength in the face of tragedy. Even though he is greatly missed, his impact will live on in the memories he left behind and the inspiration he spread.